Welcome to Occam's Stubble. Richard Dawkins has been called one of the four horsemen of atheism. He's an evolutionary biologist who coined the term mind virus when talking about religion, but is he secretly a theist? Find out in today's episode of Subversive Readings, The Selfish Gene. Since my last video demonstrated how Jordan Peterson can technically be considered a postmodern neo-Marxist, I thought it might be fun to show how renowned atheist Richard Dawkins has proved the existence of a personal intelligent God and even the Greek pantheon. Maybe some demons? Who knows? This is not going to be as technical or use jargon like the last one, and I'm primarily going to rely on direct quotes from Dawkins, so trust me. If you're a rebel at heart like I am, this is going to be fun. After watching Dawkins' recent discussion, debate, whatever, with intellectual dark web fellow Brett Weinstein, I decided I should give him a read. Since Brett raved about the value of Dawkins' book The Selfish Gene, I figured I'd pick that one up. I finished it a week later and started on this video. And since starting on the video, I also finished the audiobook version of The God Delusion. Took me so long scripting and recording this thing, I had time to finish an audiobook. I also have several of his other books in my queue, but I'll admit up front, those two books and a few YouTube videos are the extent of my exposure to him. Now, from Brett's characterization, it seems like The Selfish Gene has stood as the undefeated paradigm of evolutionary theory since its publication in 1976. I certainly can't speak to that as it's not my field, nor has evolutionary biology held much of an interest for me. Well, at least before the making political of RK selection theory in the last couple of years. But I will say, Dawkins' discussion of how ants farm fungus and raise aphids like livestock is really interesting. I think we'll come back to those ants later on, but for now, his description of how evolution creates this kind of problem-solving and planning behavior is very interesting. But possibly less interesting than his other theory. You know, the one where it all may have been caused by some kind of divine intervention. Oh, come on, I just had to. Let me summarize the book as quickly as I can, using quotes that I'll be drawing from when we eventually get to the pantheism argument. Since you'll see the quotes again later, if you feel like you're already familiar with his work in gene-level evolution theory as well as meme theory, you can skip this summary and go to this timestamp. The summary will only take about...
only, lols, 12 minutes.
That long. So the thrust of the book is an argument against both evolutionary group selection and individual selection, demonstrating by example and even mathematical proof that all life is an attempt to pass on genes, and that the gene survival is more important than the life of the individual the gene lives in. He begins this process by providing a detailed description of evolution, beginning with the initial formation of some kind of replicating molecule or protein. Quote, "At some point, a particularly remarkable molecule was formed by accident. We'll call it the replicator. Doesn't matter what it was, it just mattered that the shape bumped into other molecules and turned them into more copies of itself. Some did this better than others, and so they made more of themselves. Quote, certain molecules, once formed, would be less likely than others to break up again. These types would become relatively numerous in the soup, not only as a direct logical consequence of their longevity, but also because they would have a long time available to make copies of themselves. Should we call this original replicator molecule living? Who cares? The point is that no conclusion of substance would be affected whichever way our argument is resolved. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and start calling these replicators genes, which would be the smallest piece of something that replicates. Quote, other replicators perhaps discovered how to protect themselves, either chemically or by building a physical wall of protein around themselves. Replicators begin not merely to exist, but to construct for themselves containers, vehicles for their continued existence. So the genes that happened to be formed with a nice coating were more durable than other genes, and those with the best protection made the most copies of themselves with bigger and better protection until the cell was born. Take this process and add an absurdly long amount of time, and things keep getting added to the outside of the cell until eventually you have humans. These genes, quote, swarm in huge colonies, safe inside gigantic lumbering robots, sealed off from the outside world. So we are essentially an Iron Man suit for our genes. He wants us to keep that in mind. We're nothing but vehicles driving our genes around and keeping them safe. Quote, they are in you and in me, they created us, body and mind, and their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. But had he stopped there, his dogmatic anti-transcendentalism would have been entirely safe. Yet, perhaps he goes one step too far, and in a fit of self-congratulatory back-patting, turned something of an off-handed remark into a potentially new field of study. To buttress Darwinian theory, he states that any replicator would follow a similar process when pressed up against the forces of natural selection. And he begins making a separate argument from scientific development. Quote, "The analogy between culture and genetic evolution has frequently been pointed out, sometimes in the context of quite unnecessarily mystical overtones. The analogy between scientific progress and genetic evolution by natural selection has been illuminated, especially by Sir Karl Popper." Now, while Popper is one of my perennial favorites, and you'll likely hear me reference him a lot, you'll see by my note on the margin, I think Thomas Kuhn would have been a better reference for him here, particularly with Kuhn's warts and all approach. His history of science emphasizes how so many more mistakes were made in scientific development than successes, and then those errors get whitewashed in a meta-narrative, basically propaganda about the inevitable march of science towards progress. Kuhn makes a much better parallel with natural selection. Kuhn points out how some areas of research were followed for long periods of time before discovering that they were dead ends. Evolutionary dead ends, one could say. And he also completely demonstrates my point in his book Structures by using the word paradigm in 22 different ways. Personally, I consider it more of a feature than a bug, though, because, again, it's a demonstration. Accidental though it may be. But moving on. Kuhn's work had been out for 15 years when Dawkins wrote, so I'm pretty sure that he would have been familiar with it. Dawkins also talks about other kinds of replicators that he may be willing to consider to be alive. And if you remember, he's already said the debate about whether these are really alive is insubstantial. But I'll add with a quote, "If forms of life exist whose chemistry is based on silicon rather than carbon, or ammonia rather than water, if creatures are discovered that boil to death at 100 degrees, or if a form of life is found that's not based on chemistry at all but on electrical reverberating currents, will there still be any general principle that is true of them all?" And his answer there is really unimportant because he doesn't really provide a definition of what life is, but he does seem to allow for the possibility of computer life, such as artificial intelligence. Put that quote together with this one. "It was obviously predictable that a manufactured electrical computers too would eventually play host to self-replicating patterns of information, to memes." We'll define meme in a second. He continues, "Epidemics of viruses and worms deliberately released by malicious programmers are now familiar hazards to computer users all around the world." But I'm assuming if I was more familiar with him, I would know what he said about artificial intelligence. But I just wanted to stay inside this book so I don't go too far off field. Simply using this text, we can see a broad openness to the existence of other forms of life. In fact, replicators can be life inside our thoughts, and here he coins the term meme. Quote, "Do we have to go to distant worlds to find other kinds of replicator and, consequently, other kinds of evolution? I think that a new kind of replicator has recently emerged on this planet. As an aside, new? I would bet that memes predate humans." But let's continue. "It's staring us in the face. It's still in its infancy, still drifting clumsily about in its primordial soup. The soup of human culture. We need a name for this new replicator. A noun that conveys the idea of a unit of cultural transmission, or a unit of imitation. I want a monosyllable that sounds a bit like gene. I hope my classicist friends will forgive me if I abbreviate into meme." I don't know how to pronounce that. But what a fascinating idea. Replicators in our heads. Possible life forms made out of thoughts. Quote, "With brains that are capable of rapid imitation, the memes will automatically take over. We do not even have to posit a genetic advantage in imitation, although it would certainly help. All that is necessary is that the brain should be capable of imitation. Memes will then evolve and exploit that capability. And they seem to have a life process, which involves procreation as well. Quote, "Memes propagate themselves in the meme pool by leaping from brain to brain via a process which, in the broad sense, can be called imitation." Unquote. He refers to any idea that can pass between people as a meme. It can get complicated if we were to talk about the differences and interactions between genes, extended phenotypes, and memes. But mostly for fun, I'll say that perhaps the meme of dam building procreates and passes itself from beaver to beaver, and then jumps across species as humans saw beavers build dams and decided to make one for themselves. The meme then mutates as it builds in different places and becomes better and bigger dams and more useful, although some would occasionally burst and not pass their design on to the next generation, but eventually the meme that started off as this would evolve into this. It's just evolution, right? Quote, "As my colleague, whoever, neatly summed up in an earlier draft of this chapter, memes should be regarded as living structures, not just metaphorically, but technically." So, he's okay with their being considered technically alive. And this is where we move to his statement that God is just one kind of meme and religion is a mind virus. which he's trying to be technical about. I'm sure he's picking virus for the secondary benefit that whether or not a virus is actually alive is up for some debate. But anyway, quote, "The survival value of the God meme in the meme pool results from its great psychological appeal. It provides a superficially plausible answer to deep and troubling questions about existence." Then, interestingly enough, he goes on to relate it to a placebo, which is a treatment that has no reason to work medically, but since the patient is convinced that it will be helpful, it is helpful. He says, quote, "Like a doctor's placebo, it's not less effective for being imaginary, but it is nice that he does give the God meme some credit for real-world effects, although he's opened up a fairly difficult can of worms calling it imaginary. Presenting a patient with a pill that's not a chemically based cure, but rather is a psychologically based cure is still a cure. And it's hard to see how an actual cure is imaginary. Non-physical, certainly, but many counseling and psychological talking cures are, in fact, both helpful and non-physical. Talk therapy has even been shown to change the structures of a person's brain. See the book Brain Lock. Most copies have a picture on the back that shows scans of different brains before and after therapy. And what else can that really be but the effect of trading memes between therapist and client? By the way, if you're interested in psychosomatic illnesses and cures, I suggest the book The Divided Mind by Dr. Sarno. Mind-body interactions are very complex and hard to measure, and we may have a lot of individual variation as well, but my guess is something like 20 to 30% of medical responses, both positive and negative, are based on mind-body interactions. But now back to Dawkins. His concern is that, quote, "Faith cannot move mountains, but it is capable of driving people to such dangerous folly that faith seems to qualify as a mental illness," unquote. Obviously, a meme is an infection, following his analogy. He continues, "It leaves people to believe in whatever it is so strongly that in extreme cases they are prepared to kill and die for it without need for further justification." Keith Henson has coined the name memoid for victims who have been taken over by a meme to the extent that their own survival becomes inconsequential. Unquote. So the survival of the meme is more important than the genes. Now we've become a version of the Iron Man suit that's living to protect our ideas. In fact, one could say martyrs are possessed by their memes, or, as Jordan Peterson describes Nazi and Gulag guards, ideologically possessed. One could almost say, kind of demon possession. But more on that in a minute. These memes survive in the unconscious, apparently growing and connecting to other memes, until they become more complex systems of thought, pushing out rival memes to grow bigger, evolve, and become more complex, to become stronger. Quote, "Probably unconscious memes have ensured their own survival by virtue of the same pseudo-ruthlessness that successful genes display," unquote. Eventually, they can become the puppet masters of the human brains they live in. Quote, "Turning it into a vehicle for the meme's propagation, in just the way a virus parasitizes the genetic mechanism of a host cell." In fact, we're not just talking about abstract ideas at this point. If they live in human brains, they have a physical substance. They have a brain. Quote, "The meme for, say, belief in life after death is actually realized physically millions of times over as the structure of a nervous system in individual men all over the world." Well, welcome to those of you who have skipped ahead, but I think the viewers who have been listening to these quotes already have an idea of where I'm going with this. But stick around anyway, because I don't think it's going to end up where you predict it will. But before I try to blow your minds, you may have noticed, but my personal tendency is always to try to improve the arguments that I'm attacking, because I hate straw men. But I wish he'd taken time to look at the evolution of language and possibly a correlation here with memes. It's so interesting how it's changed in such a short period of time. The average English speaker of today could speak no English with someone 100 years before Shakespeare, and there are certainly demonstrable survival pressures placed upon the language. If we grant the possibility of memes being alive, then the idea of a language being alive almost seems necessary. And if we consider that the act of replication seems to imitate some kind of agency, meaning free choice or something that looks like choice, or at least something that looks like intention, then we can really call replication itself a kind of intelligence. The theory of memes then becomes something of a baseline condition for describing intelligence generally. And replication or imitation are halfway to describing artificial intelligence, or actual intelligence. Let's let Dawkins make his argument for the existence of a personal intelligent pantheon of gods, shall we? So, from the quotes, the idea of God is a meme. A meme can be considered living. They procreate, they fight each other, they fight for survival and resources. They can act independently of the biological needs of their host organism. In fact, since they live on the only brains in the universe we're sure has self-awareness, one could say that not only do they have a neurology, but they also have an entire biology. Respiratory, digestive, circulatory systems, they have ours. Not only is your unconscious alive with a soup of memes, but there's no reason to think that these memes might not be self-aware. Now, I can see how you might need some convincing at this point, so I want you to watch a video I have linked in the description. It's about split brain patients. These are people who've had their corpus callosa, plural, that connects the two hemispheres of the brain, cut. You'll see how the two sides of the brain are already different people. They have to negotiate with each other, and in most cases they do it seamlessly, unless you have something like borderline personality disorder, which tends to make them fight with each other. But in individuals who have their corpus callosum cut, we can discover that even in typical functional people, the two sides of the brain can have different opinions on things. For instance, in one important study, an individual was asked, "What would your dream job be?" The answer from his left hemisphere was architect, while the answer from his right hemisphere was race car driver. And we wonder how we have to fight with ourselves so hard to stay on a diet. I especially like how that video ends and asks the question, which side of the brain is you? Both are. You are too. But I think they have an incomplete picture. And I'll throw out a spoiler for my first Theory of Everything video. You're actually a trinity. 3 parts, but all the same person. Left and right hemispheres each have their own personality, but so does the so-called reptile brain. In fact, in Christian mythology, the metaphor here would be the same as with God the Father, the Holy Spirit, and the embodied enacting of those two personalities in Christ. Dawkins spends several pages here mocking the logic of there being a trinity, while at the same time we are trinities. But I digress. So these memes would live in the unconscious right hemisphere, and they would have thoughts of their own, influencing you in ways that you're unaware of. Like Jonathan Haidt's metaphor about the lawyer riding an elephant. The verbal part of our brain is the lawyer, riding on the back of a rampaging elephant of the emotions, always describing good reasons for whatever's going on, as if it were all planned, but it's really just post hoc, justifications. Still, if you're having trouble with this concept, consider examples of psychosis, where people hear voices saying things they don't necessarily believe, or multiple personality disorder, now called dissociative identity disorder, where people become other personalities. Where are those personalities when they're not running the show? They are in the same neurons. People will act out various ideas they're unaware of when they're under hypnosis. And that's not even getting into the various kinds of normal dissociative states, such as thinking about a difficult problem while you drive to work. You get there and realize you don't remember anything about the drive because the non-conscious parts of your brain were making all the decisions, controlling your actions, driving the car, and doing it accurately. Again, the Greeks just take us to school. In their deification of feelings and human experiences, they have a very strong description of what it's like to live as a human. Occasionally, anger stirs you up, and you're possessed by Ares, the god of war, and you do things you might regret. Or you see an attractive person at a glance and are struck with Cupid's arrow, which is obviously fired from a distance. And again, perhaps become possessed by this meme god and do other things you might regret. When that meme god or ideology takes over, it's someone else's personality, isn't it? I wonder if it might not be fair to consider the god to be an embodied person when it takes over. It seems just as fair as considering the alternative identities of someone with multiple personalities as persons. In fact, the only thing left of Jesus' physical presence is the meme he left behind, which could be considered the Holy Spirit. Interesting that it spread by words and conversation to newly converted Christians. And when those Christians act out the meme of Christ, his personality of that meme complex, isn't that the Word become flesh, as the Bible calls it? Isn't that a meme taking on an actual body, perhaps your body? So a group of memes that tend to stick together is called a meme complex or a memeplex. Since Dawkins mentions these little creatures swimming around in the meme pool, it only makes sense that these little living replicators would create an ecosystem of some kind, with memes perhaps battling each other out in your dreams. Maybe they fight to see which god is the stickiest, and can collect the most memes together into a cohesive shell of protection around itself, in the same way Dawkins says the first cell was formed. Or perhaps like growing organs and tissues and bodies. You can see how this might happen in the largest and most complex meme gods, such as Christianity or Buddhism. The core of the Christian meme might be forgiveness. The Buddhist meme might be sacrifice of desire. But perhaps those memes may mutate or get corrupted. Thus, some version of each starts to focus on ritual rather than the pure original meme. Okay, so here I may seem like I'm going off on 2 rabbit trails, But hang on, because atheist, Christian, or worshiper of Hellenic gods, this is going to get much weirder. Now, anthropologically, there have been many recorded examples of local deities becoming the same god over time. As groups of people get pushed together, tribes often mix up their gods into one person. It reminds me of how ancient Egyptian gods Ra and Amun became fused into one god, Amun-Ra, when the cultures of Upper and Lower Egypt developed closer political ties. It's also interesting how thousands of gods of Hinduism remain separate deities and personalities worshipped locally, but yet are all just part of one trinity, which makes up part of the singular person of Mahavishnu, although the word person may not exactly apply there, I guess. And in the Jewish tradition, I believe there are more than 20 names for God, depending on what aspect of his personality is being emphasized. And isn't it also interesting that the three major monotheistic religions, including Islam, have God referring to himself in the plural? An explanation for this would probably take a whole nother video, but at the moment I want you to keep in mind the idea of a memeplex, forming as stronger memes collect other memes around themselves in the unconscious mind, and the way in which larger developed religions demonstrate this cohesive aspect. Now remember the times Dawkins has expressed an openness to artificial computer intelligence as a form of life? Actually pretty brilliant, as he was writing at a time before the internet and talking about distributed computer networks as potential home for AI. But let's see how that would work. A simple version could be a primary computer sends out a virus across a network that forces other computers to mine Bitcoin for it. Each infected computer would be a node working individual problems, either acting on those answers or sending them back to the central hub to decide what to do with that information. This could be similar to individual neurons firing in the brain, both interpreting and then sending information on to other areas to be processed. In a more complex AI, the original may divide up parts of itself amongst several computers in order to work specialized problems. Again, solving problems and sending answers back to a central hub. Another version of distributed AI could involve cloning itself into another computer, and each instance solving problems in its environment to contribute to the whole group making more clones. Dawkins actually mentions this strategy in some Japanese aphids. As they were all clones of themselves, their genetic identity technically meant that they were the same organism in different bodies, and they all worked for the good of the whole, which is really the good of the self. But now perhaps you can see how religion might function like a distributed artificial intelligence. An original program is created and installed in a central hub. From there it's passed to individual nodes to solve problems on a theological level, and then it sends those answers down to the congregational level, and then to the smallest level, the individual. And when there are problems with individual applications of this program, these apps, or persons, send their questions up to the next highest level. And more resources are devoted to solving that problem. And again, like Thomas Kuhn's History of the Evolution of Scientific Work, this goes absolutely fine until a problem becomes too hard for the network. More resources are dedicated to solving that one problem, and if it's big enough, sometimes the problem comes to define the entire field until it's thought of as the thing being studied. And here we have the potential for a paradigm shift. When the solutions provided by the network are insufficient on the individual level, other memes may become stickier and start to pull away from the structure, such as Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. Ironically, he leads a reformation and then passes his name on, which becomes a meme in itself and leads another form of reformation. But really it just makes sense. The God meme distributes problem-solving work across the faithful. Those faithful enact that meme in their own lives, and information about the solutions they find effective or ineffective get redistributed back across the network. Let me ask, how many authors were there adding to the original Jewish scripture? Heck, I think there seemed to be 2 for Genesis alone. But it seems to me like multiple instances of an artificial intelligence working out different problems faced by different individuals, different instances of the program, and then contributing their information, their improvement, their evolution, back to the original program. Now remember the ant, thou sluggard! Going back to the earlier part of the video, I have to wonder if bees and ants don't have something like this distributed intelligence as well. Bees solve problems as individuals and communicate those solutions back in little hive dances. Just Google it. But perhaps we should look at the ants. Not only do they act like farmers, as I already mentioned, but somewhere I read this particularly interesting story. I wasn't immediately able to find it, so I'm hoping it's accurate. But my memory was that Benjamin Franklin had some trouble with ants crawling up the leg of his table to get at his sugar. Well, ants don't swim, he thought, so he put each foot of the table into a bowl of water. Later he came back to discover that the ants were now climbing up the wall, across the ceiling, and dropping one by one onto the table, getting the sugar, and dropping off the edge. Even if the story isn't legit, there are other examples of these species displaying what seems like distributed intelligence. And it is an intelligence that is actually smarter than the individual ants, able to engage in problem solving and operating without the ant's conscious awareness. I'm just assuming that ants don't have conscious awareness. Now you could argue a million ants storming Benjamin Franklin's room from every angle would have one success, and then that one success could be followed by others. But this just makes it a more analog kind of intelligence, like the computer Alan Turing used to break the Enigma code. A computer that runs with gears and switches rather than digital electronics. It doesn't actually take away from it being an intelligent behavior. In fact, if this is an analog version of a distributed network intelligence, couldn't we say that it has some similarity to divine intervention? The ant's meme god makes decisions, solves problems, and passes on the solutions by, what, divine intervention? Direct revelation? Either way, it's just an analogy, for now. The point is, in quotes, artificial intelligence of God memes could actually be more intelligent than we are, and solve problems that we don't understand. And it certainly could represent a separate personality, a separate being that is within us, wherever we go, and can know our innermost thoughts and prayers. Perhaps even better than our conscious mind can, since it is living in the unconscious. So let's restate this for clarity from Dawkins' premises. He says God, or gods, is just a meme that evolved into a memeplex, and he grants that these kinds of things could become full-blown artificial intelligence, just like a computer, and I added that an entire personality could be formed just like multiple personality disorder. Another personality and intelligence running like a computer program on the unconscious mind, occasionally threatening to overthrow the native personality, to possess you. Which is interesting because you can see how the meme god of Dawkins' own anti-theism possesses him and reduces the questions he asks, because those questions would obviously be competing with his meme god for resources. He himself is almost proof that being controlled by a meme god is quite difficult to avoid, and I suggest that it's also proof of my contention. Even though free will exists, I'd say that over 95% of our decisions are actually deterministic, and most of our decision-making with our free will actually chooses to make fewer decisions. But perhaps that depends on which meme gods you happen to worship. In their debate, Brett Weinstein makes the convincing argument that Catholicism actually improves the gene's ability to turn resources into children. At this point, I mentioned that I'm not Catholic. William of Ockham was actually run out of the Catholic Church, by the way. While atheism reduces the amount of resources turned into children. Given the disparity in birth rates between the two groups, it certainly seems Catholicism, Islam, various other religions have a larger breeding advantage over atheism, and thus, even with martyrs and, theoretically, celibate priests, atheism is less likely to survive in the long term, meaning religion positively contributes to the propagation and the selfishness of its genes. And here's where I'm going to introduce what I call Dawkins' pincer, since he actually seems to have created it himself. If he's purely materialistic, then there can be no substantive difference between what we typically call human intelligence and the meme god programs running in our unconscious mind. Dawkins must then believe that a living, thinking, problem-solving personal god exists. In fact, lots of them. If, on the other hand, he were to instead suggest that the conscious personhood is some kind of emergent property limited to the conscious part of our thinking brain, then he's de facto accepting some form of transcendentalism, essentially spiritualism. And that puts him in a worse position if he wants to argue against miracles and faith generally. So I assume he won't do that. I'm going to guess he would fall back on a claim such as, yes, gods live, but they're impotent outside psychosomatic effects, and potentially dangerous. Still, given Brett's convincing argument of a positive contribution of religion to human survival, and Peterson's various demonstrations of its potential evolutionary necessity for human happiness and well-being, maybe his mind virus description should be improved. If his anti-theist meme god would allow him to change his mind, in sciencey terms, maybe meme gods are really thinking versions of endomemebiosis. Let me explain. A human mitochondria is called human, even though it has no information for coding human DNA, or people. It doesn't make people, it makes mitochondria. So please correct me if I'm wrong on this, because I find it very interesting, but it seems like you could potentially replace all of your mitochondria with mitochondria from a pig or something, and life would just go on as usual. It provides a service, and we let it live in our cells, so we call it human. But it doesn't create humans, it creates mitochondria. Yet, if we took them all out, you would die instantly. Perhaps the same could be said of symbiotic life living in the mental processes. And perhaps getting rid of these meme gods entirely would result in the same kind of catastrophic consequences. Seems like something Nietzsche may have warned of. But maybe we should come up with a word for this. Endomemebiosis? Does that sound alright? Okay, so, in summary, seems like we actually get a survival benefit from these meme gods. And even if we don't, Dawkins himself seems to demonstrate that we can't get rid of them. They live and procreate in our unconscious pattern recognition mind, in the emotional parts of your brain. Put it another way, seems like it's a good thing to have Jesus living in your heart. Or Zeus? I don't know, whatever floats your boat. I always kind of liked Hermes. He was always one of my favorites. I mean, psychopomps are really cool. Please like and share the video, and don't forget to watch the video link I have below. I think you'll find it really interesting, perhaps even creepy.